Thank you so much, Magda. I now have the honor of introducing our guest speaker today, Professor Gibson. Nigel C. Gibson is an expert in the fields of Afrikaner thought, post-colonialism, and African studies, and is recognized as one of the leading scholars on Frantz Fanon. He has presented his work in Africa, Europe, and the Americas as well, as speaking at the UN and appearing on the History Channel. He's author of Fanon, The Postcolonial Imagination, 2003, which won the Caribbean Philosophy Association Prize, and Fanonian Practices in South Africa, from Steve Biko to Abahlali Basam Jondolo, 2011, and co-author was Robert Beneduce of Frantz Fanon, Psychiatry and Politics, 2017. He's the editor of Rethinking Fanon, 1999, Challenging Hegemony, Social Movements, and the Quest for New Humanism in Post-Apartheid South Africa, 2006, Living Fanon, 2011, and Fanon Today, Reason and the Revolt of the Wretched of the Earth, 2021. And co-editor of Contested Terrains, Contemporary Africa in Focus, 2002, Adorno, A Critical Reader, 2002, and Biko Lives, 2008. He's currently the general editor of the Journal of Asian and African Studies. Welcome, Professor Gibson, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Chanel. Thank you so much for inviting me, and it's a real pleasure to be here today. I'm going to be talking about my my new edited collection. Here it is, Fanon Today. I hope you can see it. Reason and Revolt of the Wretched of the Earth. The context for Fanon Today, Reason and Revolt of the Wretched of the Earth, is the idea of Fanonian practices, the idea that Fanon's thought not only has practical applications, but becomes enlivened by movements for liberation. My book, Fanonian Practices in South Africa, took that idea up in three ways. First, Steve Biko's engagement with Fanon became theorized through the idea of Black consciousness and articulated at the moment in the Soweto Revolution as a new generational stage of cognition and revolt. Second, as a Fanonian critique of post-apartheid South Africa. And third, through the thinking and actions of those who remain marginalized in the new civil and political society. In this case, the shack dweller organization, Abahlali Basmanjondolo, was born. They had waited patiently for the promises that freedom would bring, and then decided to no longer wait and organize collectively and democratically, demanding to be heard. And in stark contrast to the elite organization of the new regime, expressed the form of Fanonian practices from below that Fanon had theorized in Les Dames de Terre. It was this notion of the reason and revolt of the damned, of the excluded, and the uncivil in actions and movements and discussions around the world that became a framing idea for the book Fanon Today. The subtitle could also have been Revolt and Reason, rather than Reason and Revolt. Though revolt is often considered a spontaneous reaction, there is always thought and discussion that makes it happen. Revolt always includes reason, even if it's not fully thought out. The question is, how is Fanon, over 60 years after Les Dames de Terre, being discussed today among grassroots movement activists and intellectuals? What is living in Fanon? And also, what might Fanon, the revolutionary, say? The focus of Fanon Today is activist, not academic. The idea to engage activist intellectuals who are using Fanon as they think about their specific situations. This engagement is, of course, not taking place outside of discussions in universities. Indeed, Fanon is popular today, in fact, more popular than ever before, and this popularity is also marked by the place of Fanon in academia, demanded by students. Of course, there is an academic history, usually marked by Homi Bhabha and the rise of post-colonial studies in the 1980s with its focus on black skin, white masks through a Lacanian lens, focusing on ambivalence and hybridity. The 1990s saw a rise of Fanon studies on the margins of elite universities, which included articles by luminaries such as Skip Gates, as well as serious engagements within feminist studies. But Les Dames de la Terre was fairly marginal and almost non-existent in social science discussions, dismissed and outdated in the new age of neoliberal globalization. Today, the situation is different. There is a new quote-unquote academicization of Fanon, as a recent article in the Los Angeles Review of Books is titled. The article is written by an academic who, while critical of the Afro-pessimism wing of Fanon studies, elides the history of Black studies in the US. 55 years ago, African studies professors Aristide and Vera Zolberg penned an article titled The Americanization of Frantz Fanon, published in Public Interest 1967. It was in the context of the Newark and Detroit rebellions of July 1967. They report words from the editor of a radical paper, The Liberator. Fanon, he says, you'd better get this book. He was talking about Les Dames de la Terre that was translated into English as The Wretched of the Earth and published in the US in 1965. Continuing the quote from him, every brother on a rooftop can quote Fanon. This was 1967. The Black Panther Party was founded the previous October, the same year that Stokely Carmichael had raised the slogan of Black Power. It was at Howard University that a group of young activists, including Stokely Carmichael and young professors, had been reading Fanon. It was a time when Fanon was becoming so influential to debates in the civil rights and radical movements that Martin Luther King lamented in his last book that interest in Fanon far outweighed interest in Gandhi among young Blacks. All this was also reflected in the creation of the first Black Studies department a year later at San Francisco State College. This is not simply to underscore how the discipline emerged out of struggles and their discussions, but the movement itself has a history connected with the creation of such fields. This is what is elided in the LA Review of Books article, and also perhaps more importantly, within many of the elite institutions of African American studies. One article in Fanon Today, Reason and Revolt of the Wretched of the Earth, by the Marxist humanist activist philosopher Lou Turner and co-author Curtis Kelly takes up this issue. Titled, When Black Liberation Mattered, Frantz Fanon in Theory and Practice of Pan-Africanism in the Black Power Era, 1965 to 75, they review the cultural and political influences of Fanon in that period, which includes Fanon's clinical work. While the importance of translation and collection of Fanon's psychiatric writings into the volume Alienation and Freedom has brought renewed interest, it is important to highlight the work of mental health centers like the Fanon Center in Los Angeles, affiliated with the Department of Psychiatry of the Charles R. Drew Medical Center, whose history has a connection to the work of developing Black health and cultural centers after the Watts Rebellion of 1965, seen also in the Black Panther Party's idea of free medical clinics. They represent other ways in which Fanon entered the Black consciousness and struggles in the US from community to campus and back again, argues Lou Turner in the recently published collection, Frantz Fanon's Psychotherapeutic Approaches to Clinical Work, Practicing Internationally with Marginalized Communities. Fanon's clinical practice of a situational analysis, namely a diagnosis based on a patient's situation, their condition, their history and context, is also political. He was not interested in a priori models. Rather, the goal of humanizing the world, or what he called humanizing the human, had to begin from their situation implicitly critical of the medical model. As he argued in A Dying Colonialism, it is necessary to analyze patiently and lucidly each one of the reactions of the colonized, and every time we do not understand, we must tell ourselves that we are at the heart of the drama, that of the impossibility of finding a meeting ground in any colonial situation. If Fanon became alive in the debates around freedom now in the US, soon after, Fanon became essential to the development of the Black consciousness movement in South Africa, with its emphasis on the mind of the oppressed, or the mindfold manacles, as William Blake put it, as the greatest weapon in the hands of the oppressor. Black consciousness as ongoing became essential to its practical work of Black community programs, schools, daycare centers, co-ops and clinics, such as the Zanampilo Community Health Center, that more than the health center was a space for discussion, education, solidarity and celebration. An example of communal life, all this in that period before it was concretized in the Soweto Rebellion. The importance of Fanon's thought to the founding of the Black consciousness movement seems almost fantastic, since Fanon's writings were hardly available in South Africa. South African censors had banned them. And interestingly, when The Wretched of the Earth was first banned in South Africa in 1965, there was not a word in the censor's report about violence that would later dominate discussions of the book. Rather, they found the final chapter on colonial wars and mental disorders, quote unquote, far-fetched. The report marked only one page from the first chapter, and it was this, a quote from Fanon: "If conditions of work are not modified, centuries will be needed to humanize this world, which has been forced down to animal level by the imperial powers," end quote. Perhaps it was considered too Marxian and particularly threatening to the apartheid political economic system. When the book was rebanned in 1977, things were different, and the new 1974 Publications Act now included possession as a punishable offense. The 1976 Soweto revolt, which Biko had considered synonymous with Black consciousness, had shaken the country, and Fanon's influence on Black consciousness was known, well, at least known amongst BC militants and students. Yet the author of the more extensive and more superficial report focused almost entirely on an article from the then quite influential Time magazine about Fanon as a philosopher of violence. But Fanon was in fact no stranger to South Africa. His now famous analysis of the Manichaean production of colonial space, the colonial city overflowing with light, space, and good things, and the colonized spaces, a narrow world of prohibitions, very much expressed apartheid and apartheid planning, and is taken up in Fanon Today through discussions of repression and resistance in Kenya, in Trinidad, and in Portugal. Earlier in Black Skin, White Masks, Fanon asks, quote, "What is the point of meditating on Bantu ontology when 75,000 Black miners in South Africa are forced back to work at gunpoint?" End quote. And then in Le Damned de la Terre, he views the importance of Sharpeville as an international event in a quest for universality. Still, Fanon remained on the margins of the academy in the immediate post-apartheid period. When I gave a lecture on Fanon in Durban in 2004, the students' response reminded me of the quote from the Liberator editor. In this case, an elemental Fanonian practice. They were reading Fanon's Pitfalls of National Consciousness as a measure of post-apartheid South Africa, writing in the margin of the page local names for Fanon's concepts. This critique was developed in Fanonian practices in South Africa and has been well rehearsed over the last decade by students' reactions indicating how there's always an immediacy to reading Fanon. There's a liveliness to his writing, which he makes clear in response to the editor of Black Skin, White Masks, the philosopher activist Francois Janson, a deliberateness to the words that he wishes to touch people effectively, to have them feel his argument. Now, of course, we should not forget that Fanon was a product of a particular historical moment marked by continual anti-colonial revolt against French colonialism, from the brutal murder of 100,000 in Madagascar uprising of 1947 to 1949, the 7-year anti-colonial war in Vietnam that led to the defeat of the French in 1954, and then the 7-year Algerian war against the French. And each of his books reflects its own particular moment, and he's quite clear on their limitations, while insisting in Les Damnés de Terre that, quote, each generation must out of relative obscurity discover its mission, fulfill it or betray it. So let's return to Fanon Today, The Reason and Revolt of the Wretched of the Earth, published in November 2021. The first submission was a discussion of Fanon's Wretched of the Earth that took place in Durban in March 2020 with members of the Shack Dweller movement, Abahlali Basmanjondolo. The conversation started with a focus on a number of quotes from the book, engaging the Shack Dwellers thinking about their situation, the land question, the question of organization, the question of repression and political murder. This was before the murders of 2 leaders from Abahlali's Ekenana commune, Ayanda Ungila and Lindo Unguni. It was before they had created the Frantz Fanon School and before they had named the settlement a commune. That naming is in itself significant, quite different from naming streets and buildings after past struggle heroes. This is a living political form that is being worked on in daily life and worthy of further discussion. There must be an idea of man and the future of humanity, Fanon argues in Les Damnés de Terre. That is to say, that no demagogic formula and no collusion with the former occupying power can take the place of a program. And the rationality of revolt is expressed in many ways, as we see throughout the book. Leah Tolstoy describes the Mundukuru's people struggle in the Amazon as their very existence being resistance. The decommodification of land and water, of the rivers and the minerals requires a rethinking, as Fanon puts it. And here we find the shack dwellers in South Africa, Abahlali Basmanjondolo, and the Munduruku people and other struggles, often thousands of miles apart, offer similar perspectives, understandings of the violence of the state to silence these movements as desperate acts to silence the future of humanity. Fanon Today, The Reason and Revolt of the Wretched of the Earth, is a collection of 22 chapters and 3 poems, purposefully published by a movement press, which makes the book available for nothing. The audience, in other words, will not be limited to those who can pay. As one reviewer put it, it is the collective labor of love, of the here and now, the voices of the marginalized and silenced, from Algeria to Brazil, Ireland to Kenya, Palestine to Portugal, South Africa to Trinidad and beyond, actively humanizing our precious and fragile earth. The cover showing a red sun next to Fanon's head on top of the Abahlali demonstrators is an expression of movement of people and ideas. There's the cover. And actually, this cover it is the artist who put it together. At least the first form of the cover. It is an artist from Johannesburg. So this idea of movement of people and ideas, it was these invisible threads and connections that I wanted to capture in Fanon Today. And now a year later, seen in the women life freedom movement in Iran. How can Fanon's writing on the dialectics of liberation in Algeria, in his book, Year 5 of the Algerian Revolution, known as A Dying Colonialism, articulate with a new generation of revolutionaries in Iran today, an Iran where woman life freedom revolt is a daily happening, and Fanon's concepts of the radical mutations in consciousness that he talks about in Dying Colonialism, or Year 5 of the Algerian Revolution. Radical mutations in consciousness and in body experience take on new life as the veil, a piece of clothing, is again politically contested in terms of women's self-determination and has resonated across the nation through the continuous actions of young women and men, whose average age of those arrested is 15 years old, suggesting a new generation threatening the regime, challenging not only the strict rules of the morality police, but also expressed by the new figures of resistance in urban spaces. Asking the question, is the uprising in Iran a feminist revolution? An Iranian feminist, Elle, writes of her own experience of being drawn into the protests, the ordinariness of burning headscarves and police attacks, and the new experience of bodies in space in thought and action. She writes of thinking about running and finding yourself running. The body moves ahead of cognition, she adds, expressing an element of what Fanon meant by a new dialectic of the body in his essay, Algeria Unveils Itself, as women unlearn, relearn, and quote unquote invent, he says, new dimensions for her body on the street. Released from our bodies, Elle writes, women has become, quote, figures of resistance, stimulating, she adds, quote, the desire of other women, making the feminist revolution distinguished by, quote, the collective desire and consciousness. What Fanon calls radical mutations is occurring in personal and political imaginations where women, quote, go to the street with the bodies that they are, they go to the street not with the bodies that they are, but she writes, with the bodies that they can and want to be, when every organ of the body goes beyond its self-awareness and the ways it has learnt to be. Expressing the maturity of the revolt, these figures of resistance, Elle adds, were, quote, already present in the unconscious of the protesters without ever having been practiced, as though they'd been practicing them for years. What would Fanon say, who ended black skin, white masks with the prayer, "Oh, my body, always make me a man who questions"? Year 5 of the Algerian Revolution's first chapter, Algeria Unveiled, or more literally and actively, Algeria Unveils Itself, is perhaps the most discussed chapter in an otherwise undiscussed book. A new revolutionary subject is unveiled, with revolutionary women, Fanon argues, appearing without preliminary instruction. History is in the making. Sorry about this, I've just lost my place. With women's entry into the public, history is in the making, with women's entry into the public sphere becoming what he calls an intense dramatization, a continuity between woman and revolutionary, end quote. They reinvent their sense of themselves in their sense of body in space, traveling unaccompanied throughout the city, carrying messages, guns and bombs, They set bombs. They stay with unknown comrades. They give refuge to militants in their own homes, and on their own initiative, they take part in FLN discussions and activities. In an important passage, speaking of the young Algerian women's navigating the European city during the Battle of Algiers, Fanon writes of women's invention of new dimensions of her body, new means of what he calls muscular control, learning how to, quote, create for herself a new attitude, overcoming timidity and awkwardness. This idea of an authentic birth without any previous instructions has resonance with Fanon's conception of Black self-consciousness as an absolute intensity of beginning in Black Skin, White Masks. Here in the Algerian context, Fanon finds the coming to be of a new subjectivity and a new social individual. That women's liberation, or indeed even institutional equality in Algeria, turned out to be only temporary, as women were soon forced back from public life, does not undermine Fanon's claims that radical changes in consciousness and in social relations had not taken place. Rather, it indicates the power of conservative forces within the nationalist movement. The counter-revolution underlines the unfinished nature of decolonization, which becomes a paramount concern in Fanon's last year of life. Of course, one major difference is that the contemporary Iranian revolt is not organized by a political organization. There is, of course, organization in its activities, but there's no central organization like the FLN. And while Fanon understood the importance of organization, he was not uncritical of such organizations. But was Fanon too uncritical of the internal realities in Algeria, including political conservatism dressed in the name of Islam? He certainly was aware of such politics in Algeria, and in response to a letter Fanon received from the Iranian activist scholar Ali Shariati, who underscored the importance of a revival of Shiism to the struggle, Fanon made his position clear. While he hoped that what Shariati called the quote-unquote authentic intellectuals, quote, may make good use of the immense cultural and social resources harbored in Muslim societies and minds, with the aim of emancipation and the founding of another humanity, end quote, that's Fanon. He critically notes that Shariati's interpretation of the rebirth of religious spirit, and he says, your efforts to mobilize this great power is now prey to internal conflicts or impaired with paralysis, and appears as a withdrawal into itself. Fanon fought against paralysis, clinically and politically. The idea is expressed in his notion of colonial Manichaeism, and its will to motionless and petrification. It's also expressed in his critique of Europe in the conclusion to Les Dames de Terre, where he says, comrades, let us flee from this motionless movement where gradually dialectic is changing into a logic of equilibrium. Let us consider the question of humanity. Let us consider the question of cerebral reality and of the cerebral mass of humanity, whose connections must be increased, whose channels must be diversified, and whose messages must be rehumanized. And yet Fanon's dialectic does not dismiss the idea of withdrawal into self. It is a critical philosophical point that Fanon underscores, and which Biko had quoted as a philosophic principle of Black consciousness, that, quote, the consciousness of self is not the closing of a door to communication. Philosophic thought teaches us, on the contrary, that it is its guarantee. National consciousness, which is not nationalism, is the only thing that will give us an international dimension. The dialectic of movement and self-movement is what was at stake in Fanon's critique of Shariati, who would go on to translate an anthology of Fanon's work into Persian and would be an important intellectual influence during the 1979 revolution. In his response to Shariati, Fanon cannot be clearer. Fanon says, quote, "My path diverges from and is even opposed to yours," end quote. Fanon's criticism is embedded in what he would call the misadventures, the literal translation of the French, or the pitfalls of national consciousness in Les Dames de la Terre, which were taking place across the continent. And he critically remarks to Shariati that the limitations of Shariati's path is similar to, quote, Senghor, Jomo Kenyatta, Nyerere, and Kateb Yassin, all of whom undertook to revive African nationalism, or else of Henri Alleg's revival of classicism. Instead, in Les Dames de la Terre, he advises that the anti-colonial struggle must, quote, guard against the danger of perpetuating tradition, which holds sacred the superiority of the masculine element over the feminine. Women will have exactly the same place as men, not just in the clauses of the Constitution, but in the life of every day. Fanon provides a diagnosis and a prognosis in Les Dames de la Terre, summing up his experiences from Algeria to West Africa. Just earlier in 1961, his comrade Lumumba was murdered. Less than a year earlier, Fanon had written that the Congo, which constituted the second landing beach for revolutionary ideas, was caught in an inextricable network of sterile contradictions, end quote. Or in other words, it was becoming motionless. And in an analysis printed 2 years earlier in El Mujaddid in July 1958, titled "The First Truths of the Colonial Problem," Fanon was already arguing for a second phase of liberation. Today, a new humanism, he says, is coming into being, which has its root in man. The second phase of total liberation is necessary and required by the popular masses. The first phase, if you will, was gaining independence, represented by a new government taking political power. You might even, at least at that point, have nationalization of oil or the banks, but things do not really change for the mass of people. In other words, life for most people continues in the same way. And people ask, was the struggle for independence worth it, as Fanon puts it in Les Dames de la Terre? This first stage has a narrow political objective, and decolonization is reduced to taking over the institutions of political power. For Fanon, the goal of social liberation means there has to be a new phase, and he says it's not going to be easy or quick because it involves the total uprooting of colonialism. The Fanonian second liberation suggests a new beginning. Framed neither by the state or party. The question is, where does this new phase come from? It seems to me that we could say that it's been continually stymied. So instead, we seem to have a continuous repetition of the first phase, increasingly authoritarian, increasingly corrupt, increasingly bereft of ideas. Politics, even if it calls itself democratic, is elitist and barred to most people. So it's necessary to look to new movements outside of the elite spheres. The question comes, what is actually going on outside of politics at the level where, to use Fanon's terms, the popular masses are? What are the actual spaces and possibilities for social change in the nation? Often these impulses are not articulated in a political way, and the answer is not immediately apparent. Fanon, again, doesn't provide any ready-made answers, though he does give examples in Les Dames de la Terre. In the chapter on the pitfalls of the national consciousness, he writes, "We African politicians must have a clear idea of the situation of our people. But this clarity of ideas must be profoundly dialectical. The awakening of the whole people will not come about all at once. The people's work in building of the nation will not immediately take on its full dimensions. The sense of time must no longer be that of the moment or the next harvest, but rather that of the rest of the world." And finally, he importantly adds, because demoralization buried deep within the mind of colonialism is still very much alive. And at the same time, he's critical of political militants who, acting in the immediacy, just want to get things done, putting a plan into action without the important work of encouraging the people's self-activity and self-knowledge. And he gives an example of this dialectic and his idea of time. He has an example of building a bridge. And he says, if the building of a bridge does not enrich the consciousness of those working on it, then don't build the bridge and let the citizens continue to swim across the river or use a ferry. The bridge, in other words, this is about development from below, right? The bridge must not be pitchforked or foisted upon the social landscape by a deuxième machina, but on the contrary, must be a product of the citizens' brains and muscles. It's not a product for the planners, it's a product of the citizens' brains and muscles. And there's no doubt architects and engineers, foreigners for the most part, will probably be needed, but the local leaders must see to it that the techniques seep into the desert of the citizen's brain so that the bridge in its entirety and in every detail can be integrated, redesigned, and reappropriated. The citizen must appropriate the bridge. Then and only then is everything possible. And in a critique of capitalist efficiency, he adds, quote, "Experience proves that the important point is not that 300 people understand and decide, but that all understand and decide, even if it takes twice or three times as long. In fact, the time taken to explain the time, quote unquote, lost humanizing the worker will be made up in the execution. People must know where they're going and why." As I said, in his clinical work, he focused on the importance of a situational analysis. The results are not always clear. Rather, they can produce new questions, highlight errors or mistakes. This is exactly what he meant when he said, every time we do not understand, we must tell ourselves we're at the heart of the drama. Rather than proceeding from a preconceived model, the situational questions Fanon asks are one that activist intellectuals could follow. In this, there's tremendous positivity in Fanon's critical and self-critical attitude. "I must constantly remind myself," he says in the conclusion to Black Skin, White Masks, "that the real leap consists in introducing invention into life." Fanon believed in the power of the mind. Indeed, when confronted with the diagnosis of leukemia, he said to his friends that he was going to fight it. "With what?" a friend replied. He slapped his forehead with his forefinger and said firmly, as if it went without saying, that he would be the winner, "with the cortex." There is an openness here to the work of thought in the combining of bodies and our brains, which also speaks to those who he's writing to, which can be read alongside his comment from Le Dernier de Terre. Perhaps, he says, everything needs to be started over again. The soil, the subsoil, the sun, the rivers, explained, discussed in plain language with people who are not just the subject of Fanon's revolutionary humanism, but its reason. Thus, he challenges us immediately and concretely to repeat the quote that frightened the South African censors. If working conditions are not modified, it will take centuries to humanize this world, which the imperialist forces have reduced to the animal level. And the question of humanizing this world is deeply connected with thinking about the land, the rivers, the sun, recovering knowledge and reinvigorating ways of life. Let us waste no time in sterile litanies and nauseating mimicry, his parting statement declares. Leave these spaces where they're never done talking of humanity, yet murder everywhere they find them. Let us combine our muscles and our brains in a new direction. Let us try to create the whole human being. Thank you very much. I think I've come in under the 45-minute mark.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. This was a very interesting presentation. I'd like to hand over to Prof. Makoni, and then he will start with questions with you. Prof.
Yes, Nigel, thank you very much for this stimulating presentation. I want to try and engage in a conversation in which I make you central to the conversation and not Fanon. When did you first begin, when were you first exposed to Fanon? Where did you encounter Fanon's writing? I'm trying to understand your reaction. Yes, then
okay.
We can. Yeah.
Okay, you want a biography? Biography is the idea.
Yes.
I first actually, it was about 1980. I came across this pamphlet written by Lou Turner and John Allen, two Marxist humanists from the US, called Frantz Fanon, Soweto, and American Black Thought. And this was the this was the first time I came across Fanon. And what was really important to me, I was an anti-apartheid activist, at the time. What was important to me was how they explained how Fanon had come alive in South Africa to Steve Biko. In other words, this idea of Fanon's thought being re-articulated in a new situation brought Fanon alive. I mean, in a certain sense, it's also expressed in Fanonian practices. The idea that Steve Biko was the first Fanonian practicer in a certain sense of Fanon in South Africa, and you can see the practice as a new philosophy, which is the Black consciousness movement. So, in other words, that was my first introduction to Fanon. How Fanon's thought can come alive again in another situation. So that was my first introduction to Fanon. So then I started reading. I started reading. This is after I was about in my early 20s. I started reading Fanon and thinking about Fanon. It was 1981. And there was the hunger strike in the north of Ireland, and I was thinking about Fanon, whether I could think about Fanon for the Irish situation. So I was thinking about how do you use these ideas in a new situation.
And when when you look at how your ideas about Fanon have evolved, which interpretation of Fanon did you think you got wrong? When you look back now over the long period of time that you have been grappling with the ideas about Fanon, let's put aside the ones where you think you got them right. Which one do you think, oh, I think I was wrong here in my thinking about Fanon?
Wow, that's an interesting one. I don't know whether I can really think about whether I got something wrong, because in a certain sense, I think whenever you're reading Fanon, and I've taught Fanon for over 20 years, but every time I teach Fanon, I reread the book. I don't just go in and think I know what the book is, because it's a new situation with a new group of students, and so it's not so much a question of thinking that I got something wrong. It's thinking that I have a new insight on something I'm reading now that I didn't notice before. I think there's many pieces in, and of course other Fanon scholars can also raise issues and also highlight issues that you've just not noticed. I think I've got wrong the things I haven't noticed, rather than I've had the wrong interpretation. I mean, obviously, I've certainly don't stick to one simple interpretation, but I don't think it's a case of saying, okay, I had a conception of Fanon's notion of Black consciousness 40 years ago, and my conception is different now. I'm certain it is different. I'm certain it is different, much more with much more experience and so forth. But I wouldn't say I'd got it. Wrong and right might be a wrong way,
too
binary conception.
Okay, let me paint this scenario for you. You talked about the shack dwellers who may be using Fanonian practices. You also talked about how you were teaching Fanon to students. Assuming hypothetically you had a class which included both the shack dwellers and the students that you have taught, what will their dialogue be about Fanon? What will they be talking about? Right.
Well,
you have these shack dwellers who, and somehow miraculously you are able to set up. I guess you can do that nowadays through Zoom, and they are all together, the students, the shack dwellers, and you are running your class. What would they want to learn about each other's reactions to Fanon?
Yes, I mean, it really would depend on also who the students are.
Okay, let's just choose these are graduate students from any one of the universities that you have taught.
Yeah. Well, I actually teach at sadly, well, not sadly, I only teach undergraduate classes.
Oh, that's so. So let's move to undergraduate students. That would make it much nicer.
but I much nicer, right? Okay. And often they have no background in Fanon, and so it's a real challenge for them. But interestingly, one of when you all get your copy of Fanon Today,
yes.
Which you can get from Daraja Press, as I mentioned, you'll see that each section, there's 3 sections in the volume. There's the first section, which is called Fanonian Militants. The second section is called Still Fanon. and this idea of stillness in a kind of double sense.
Yes.
Fanon is still here, but also we're stilled. And then the third section is called Fanonian practices. Each section begins with a poem, and it's a poem that is one of these blackout poems. I don't know whether you're familiar with them, but anyway, they look a little like that.
Oh, I see. Okay.
So you have a page of the Wretched of the. This is a page of the Wretched of the Earth. It blacked out certain lines and there's a poem made out of it. And this was a project. This was a student in my last Fanon class, a poet who created these poems. So many of the students where I teach are in in the creative fields.
Yes.
They're artists. They're filmmakers. They're writers. They're poets, and so forth. And so I think there would be an interesting kind of connection between this kind of element of creativity that they would bring to the discussion with the shack dwellers. And the interesting thing about the shack dweller discussion, which was, as I mentioned, March 2020. Which you remember, it was about a week before the lockdown in the US, at least. I went to it was held in their office in Durban, and I printed out about 2 pages of quotes from the Wretched of the Earth and distributed them. And then the discussion really was about, I sort of introduced and talked about these quotes, gave some context and explanations, and then it sort of opened up. And then they opened up in a sense that they would then start talking about what these quotes meant to them. And how they understood it, and that's how the question of land came up and so forth. Well, I didn't introduce the question of land. The question of land came up through their discussions. So I think there would be you'd get a sort of the way in which the students and the shack dwellers would exchange would be sort of a dialogue on one hand based on the kind of concrete lived experiences of the shack dwellers. Not to say the students don't have their own concrete lived experiences. Of course they do. And that would be at one level, but also at a sort of the level of the aesthetic as well, in terms of poetry. And of course, the shack dwellers are also, singers and poets and so forth. So I think it would open up along those kinds of levels, rather than say along certain disciplines.
Okay, thanks a lot. Let me hand over to Edwin, because there are a number of questions in the chat, and then Edwin will take over. Edwin.
Yeah, thanks, Prof. So there are a couple of questions in the chat. I'll begin with the questions in the chat, and then those who have raised up their hands, I'll call them. So Turner is asking this question. Nigel, do you think Fanon's reference to women's dramatization of self in revolution a gesture to Hegel's treatment of Antigone in the phenomenology of spirit, given Fanon's earlier engagement with Hegel's lordship bonded discussion in the phenomenology? I'm not sure if I got the question right, but yeah.
Can I see the question?
Yeah, it's in the chat box.
Oh, okay. I got it now.
Yeah, it's by.
Or you could ask the person, Edwin, to.
Let me ask it.
Yeah.
He said, Nigel, do you think Fanon's reference to women's dramatization of self in revolution a gesture to Hegel's treatment of Antigone in the phenomenology of spirit, given Fanon's earlier engagement with Hegel's lordship bondage discussion in the phenomenology?
Lou Turner's asking me a question that Lou Turner should probably answer because he's more, because he, but let me just say that the question of Fanon's engagement with Hegel is actually a really fascinating one, an important one, and I think it's been too quickly dismissed by the sort of idea that Fanon is essentially dismissing Hegel. Now, of course, there's an element of that in his critique of Hegel and the master-slave dialectic, but there's also a way in which one could read that section of and not only that section, but read that section alongside his introduction to the lived experience of the Black, the 5th chapter of Black Skin, White Masks, as one where this notion of recognition and reciprocity remains absolutely essential to Fanon's conception of humanization and the human, social relations. So it's not as though he says that he's not as though he's saying the Hegelian dialectic is it's not as though he's dismissing the idea of dialectic in general. He's just saying, in this, if you add race or color to the dialectic, Hegel's dialectic no longer works in the way that Hegel is arguing. In fact, it has to become a kind of, it has to be deepened. And so Black consciousness becomes, you know, incredibly important to that. So I can't really answer the Antigone side of Lou Turner's question. I'd love to know what he thinks. But I do think that it's interesting to think about Fanon's conception of Black consciousness as a kind of body experience alongside his idea of women in the Algerian Revolution, or women during the Battle of Algiers, reinventing and relearning and without any previous notion of how they were going to do this, of navigating the streets of colonial Algiers. There's definitely sort of connections in terms of his philosophy, and also in terms of his idea of his clinical, of his notion of the body in space, not just politically, but also clinically. In other words, the free movement of the body, you know, how you navigate, you know, the whole way in which he begins chapter 5 of lived experience of the Black, talking about, I move, you know, the Merleau-Ponty piece where he moves his body and he moves through his cigarettes in the drawer and he gets his matches, and you have this idea of your body in space. And then he says, you know, but in the Black, if you're Black, there's a completely different, it doesn't work like that. You know, you're completely over-determined. You're completely objectified. So you navigate space in a completely different way because you're forced, and then you have to come through that experience. And so it's a kind of this connection he makes between body experience and the mind is, and therefore as liberation, human liberation is incredible, is very important. And I think one that hasn't really been significantly discussed.
Yeah. Thank you. So Arthur also has a question, and I'd like to read a question. So he says, in reading the works theorizing decolonization, the stages of liberation, etc., he always thinks that the context of discussion is incomplete. That is, the external threats, for example, assassination, sabotage, cooptation from the metropole, the US, the Britain, France, etc., are not theorized into the discussion of decolonization. So this is his question. What are your thoughts on how we can dialectize, so to speak, liberation and reaction to liberation?
I mean, for Fanon, the threat is always there. The external threat is always there. The colonial threat is always there. I think what I wanted to do in Fanonian practices in South Africa, for example, was to focus less on the external threat than the internal decomposition of the liberation movement under the pressure of the external threat. In other words, the external threat could be, okay, so there was no choice, right? The external threat is that you have you have the World Bank, the IMF, you have the US and European capital, and therefore you have to make a deal, and you go from you go from RDP to GEAR. You go from a notion of social democracy to basically just neoliberalism. And the argument is, well, within that small frame, you just don't have any, you don't have any choice, and therefore that's the only thing we could do. That's the, that could be considered the first phase, right? You have political power, but you can't really do very much with the political power. But then Fanon's argument is, well, how do you continue to the second phase? Can you continue to the second phase in the logic of the weight of external the logic of the weight of external pressure would mean that in fact we got no choice. But the decisions made by the ANC, for example, are that they wanted to control the situation and rule in a way through a kind of top-down approach, close down opportunities for different kinds of developments. So where Fanon talks about the bridge, for example, or house building, for example, why weren't you could have had a whole different notion of building houses at the beginning from in the late 90s. You could have included communities in ideas about where the houses would be built, how the houses would be built, and so forth. Instead, there was an approach which was completely from above, which meant the removal of shack settlements to spaces 10, 15, 20 miles away from the city, in these kind of windswept places with these houses built by tender and so forth, didn't involve the people in the building of the houses. So it wasn't a democratic approach. Fanon talks about what can the politics, what can the post, what can the sort of politics and anti-colonial politics look like? And he talks about having to decentralize the organization, that the militants have to go out into the rural areas and live with the rural people. I'm not saying that's the answer. I'm just saying that the idea of in South Africa was let's take over the government in Cape Town and Pretoria, and let's take over the urban areas, and the rural areas will just kind of move together, move at the back of our trail. But it never was one where it included, in a democratic way, masses of people. It didn't at all. The only moment of including masses of people was when you voted, and that's when people would come round and give you lots of promises about what we'd do if you vote for us, and how we'd get you things. There'd be a payoff. The vote was worth some kind of payoff. So I think that the question of what you do under the constraints of what you are under is important. And I think that's where the real judgment comes in about what has happened to the continent since the independence struggles.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
In other words, yes, it's most certainly true that colonial and the neo-colonial and also the world powers dominate the continent.
Mm.
There's absolutely no doubt about that. But the question is, what do you do under that situation? You can't just get out. You can't get out of it, but it doesn't mean that your thinking has to be determined by that, that you're thinking about making connections with people has to be determined first by these external powers.
Mm-hmm. Let me narrow my question and ask, where in the work of Fanon specifically do you see specificities of external threats discussed and incorporated into what is said about the liberatory, emancipatory process, which I use the term decolonization for? So I'm asking, are specificities in the work of Fanon, and I'm asking you, incorporated into his theorizing, and I think we can use that term, about the decolonialization process?
I mean, if you read his articles about Lumumba, they're very specific.
Mm-hmm.
They're the political articles that you can find in towards the African revolutions. They're very specific. And then of course, he's also quite specific in terms of the context for chapter 1 of The Wretched of the Earth, when he talks about the context of the Cold War, being drawn into one camp or another.
Mm-hmm.
And he's also, and then in the pitfalls of national consciousness, he also talks about the context. He doesn't get into the details of it, but he also gets into this whole question of reparations and so forth. And of course, and we should also remember that, this is a moment of openness. It's not clear in 1960 that that the root of all, that the future is determined as we can see it now. For us, looking back 60 years, we can say, oh, well, it was obvious that was going to happen. It was just all happening because of the global political economy. But he's seeing the moment of 1960, of African liberation as being actually an opening, a chance, so to speak, a moment where things could be different. So he's writing at that moment. He's seeing the internal contradictions. He's seeing the external threats, but he's seeing the opportunity. I think it's difficult for us now to read it and think to think that he's being optimistic. But I don't think it's a question of being optimistic or necessarily discounting the threat from global powers. I think it's just a sort of like the fact that the liberation, this is an incredible, as you know, an incredible moment in history, in world history, where the world is, the colonial world is being decolonized.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Just very quickly, where does he talk about Lumumba and also the Cold War?
The Cold War is in the first chapter of The Wretched of the Earth. The Lumumba, he writes essays published in El Mujadid and in other places as well. I can't remember. I don't have access to them now. But in the book Towards the African Revolution, there's a number of articles that he has that are on Lumumba there. The one I quoted from I think 1958 is there as well. But anyway, you'll be able to find them then. And if you can't, just email me, and I'll get back to you with with the references.
Oh, okay, thanks.
Yeah. And there's also a question that you mentioned a free copy of the book Fanon Today 2021, but some people are saying it seems it is not free online. Do you have a free copy that you could share with? Yeah.
The free copy is online. That's right. It's Daraja Press. They do ask you for a donation, but if you didn't put if you put 0 in, they'd still give you access to the online version of the book. It's not a free book. It's not a free paper book. It's a free online book. I can also, anyone who wants to email me, I can send a PDF too as well. If that's, I'm happy to share.
Okay. Yeah. So moving on, Cecil also has a question. She asked, could you talk about the ways Fanon was read, ignored, instrumentalized, or understood during the Rhodes Must Fall movement in South Africa?
That's a very big question. I actually wrote an article on this, so you could. So I don't know if I can sum, and I've forgotten what I said mostly, but I'm happy to send you the article as well. But essentially, what happened was that what's interesting about that moment, the Rhodes Must Fall moment, was that Fanon. It was amazing that Fanon was now being discussed in the media, like in the regular, in the newspapers, on radio shows and so forth, which is a great thing, seeing as he'd been so marginal in a certain way to discussions. But there's always there's positives, but the negatives were that he was being reduced in a certain sense to like to quotes, or even like misquotes. So although his name was being mentioned often, it didn't really necessarily mean that there was real engagement with his thought. It just meant that he was being recognized. And I think this was happening not only to Fanon, but to others as well. They were becoming figures, so to speak, ancestors of the struggle. I think, and I think one of the, retrospectively, and I don't really take this up in the article, which has a lot to do with Rhodes University and the struggles there. And the kind of grassroots organizing and so forth. but it's interesting that Witz, it became a kind of a kind of dividing line on the question of violence or destruction. So there were these ways in which Fanon was reduced to somebody who wanted to just like, you know, burn down colonialism. So in other words, burn down the student blocks or burn down the libraries. That was the way in which Fanon was trying to be used, sort of simply as a question of destruction. And there was, you know, some who certainly were interested in using Fanon that way as well. And that was perhaps also, you know, a dominant thread of Fanon's Fanon discussions. It wasn't the dominant thread at Rhodes University, or the university formerly known as Rhodes, but it was at other places, perhaps at UCT and so forth. So there was an internal politics that had to be understood, that I can only understand now retrospectively. I didn't really understand at the moment, where there was interests in using Fanon to support certain political kinds of positions. As I said, I have written an article about this. It's a few years old now, but it does raise some of these issues. But certainly Fanon was contested. And of course, what needed to be done at that time was open up discussions of Fanon. Whether or not they opened up or not, I'm not sure. But what also happened, interestingly, is that a sort of marketization of the idea of decolonizing. So now managements of South African universities want to tick the decolonization box on their, you know, reports. And so by doing certain things, like let's have a Fanon seminar, that ticks the decolonization box without actually any real change, without any real fundamental change. So Fanon was being used, right, by managements, being used by systems in a certain sense, to encourage a certain kind of politics which was not really Fanonian. At least the Fanon that I've tried to discuss today.
Thank you. Scott had a question before I move to Eugene and Sally Coco. Okay. So Eugene is asking, was Biko's Black Consciousness movement the clearest expression of Fanon's thought as organization?
That's a great question, because the question then becomes, what is Biko's conception of Black consciousness as organization? I mean, you know, Fanon, and what's Fanon's conception of organization? I mean, Biko's conception of organization is one that's ongoing. And it's interesting in a certain sense that the form of organization had to change because of repression. And this gets us back to the external realities, not just the external realities of global imperialism, but the external realities of apartheid police regime, right? So you start off with Black consciousness being within an organization of thought within a student movement, and then which breaks with the student movement and is really about discussing ideas and developing a local level, and it's about consciousness raising, conscientizing, right? So it's about education and so forth. So its early iteration is quite horizontal. But then repression means that it has to build other forms, has to be less open, and then banned, right? Then all the Black consciousness organizations, after Biko's death, all the Black consciousness organizations are banned. So a new organization, it evolves, a Zappo. And what form does that have? Much more formal than the Black consciousness movement organizations. In other words, a formal structure as a political party, a political organization. It does raise a really interesting question about Fanon's relationship to the FLN, which is again a formal structured organization. But within that formal structure, and of course, it comes out of a whole history of Algerian liberation organizations, revolutionary organizations and underground organizations, a history which has sort of meant that the militants in those organizations know about discipline, right? Because you're operating within a structure where, you have to keep quiet. And the whole so the structure of the FLN is very much a sort of underground, in its beginnings, very much underground structure. But then Fanon becomes very close to Ramdana Barney, a Kabylian revolutionary, and a socialist revolutionary, who argues at the Sumam conference in 1956, a conference that takes place, almost under the noses of the French, in the Sumam area. Where he argues against, he sees, Abani's very concerned about the militarization, the way in which the military commanders are taking control of the organization. He wants all military decisions to be political, and he also sets out an idea of what they're fighting for. What's the goal of the liberation struggle in Algeria? Fanon remains committed to Abani's vision, and Abani is actually murdered by the FLN militarists in 1957. Fanon finds out about it. It's not until 1958 is it actually made public. May 1958, Fanon finds out about it, and apparently Fanon was known to be an Abani, connected with Abani, and was, and was considered a threat to the FLN militarists, and would, if Fanon, was considered someone that may have to be eliminated himself. Anyway, Fanon remained committed to Abani's notion of social liberation, and in fact developed it in Dying Colonialism. Is very much along those lines, and also developed in terms of its idea of what social liberation would be by the experience of the revolution, by the revolution's own kind of coming into being of new personalities and so forth. So he's very aware of internal threats within this hierarchical organization. So the FLN can't necessarily be considered, I mean, Fanon's a member of the FLN, but it can't necessarily be considered a Fanonian organization, nor the organization of which Fanon thought the new society would be built. So Fanon's concept of organization is something different from the FLN. Is Biko's notion of Black consciousness, the idea of Black consciousness, could be considered philosophically an idea of what a new South Africa could be, or at least the beginnings of a new South Africa? But is it the form of organization of a new South Africa? I think that in the end, one can't read off a political organization and think that in this particular case, or in this particular situation, is anything other than a product of a particular situation. So I think the question of organization and a new society, or a different society, or a humanizing society is a really, really important one. How do you create an organization that actually expresses the new society that you want to be built? What is the form of, what is the form and content of that organization? Fanon doesn't answer that question, but I think it's an incredibly important question, especially since the ANC, who took over in South Africa and took over it's a very hierarchical organization, all the way down to, like, the local shack leaders, the way in which the ANC incorporated civil society, the civics and so forth, into its organization in this hierarchical way, meant that once it gained power, it would also still be an authoritarian, democratically authoritarian organization. So the question of how the organizational form of a new society is expressed through a philosophy like Fanon's or philosophy like Biko's is a real pressing one.
Okay, thank you. Salikoko has a question. Salikoko.
Yeah, thank you very much. I had intended actually to return to Arthur Spear's question in comparing Frantz Fanon's writing with the growing growing discourse on decoloniality. That for him, all the arguments seem incomplete, because what is the voice of what is being contested is not represented. I think I got that right, Arthur. And so, but I thought of that as being a given, that the starting point is dissatisfaction with the status quo, either colonialism and the colonizer, or writings that have disadvantaged the underdog, so to speak, people who are not, that should be represented in better light. And so in this kind of discourse, you focus on what you are rejecting. I didn't think that it would be a dialogic process, but maybe there is something that is missing that I would like to learn more about in terms of what is really incomplete, Arthur, if you can address this. On the other end, as you were ending your last answer, Nigel, I got the impression that the revolutionaries ought to have a clear idea of the alternative that they would like to construct. That's very hard. They focus so much in articulating what is bad, what kind of oppression is in place, or what kind of discourse is dominant, and the kinds of things that they would like to see changed. But I don't know of any revolution where everything has been planned up to the point or the comma or whatever. And what is at stake is that there is a problem and people need solutions to the problem. And what you see, like in the case of South Africa, different people coming with alternative solutions. Or in the case of the United States, during the civil rights movements, people having different approaches to how to remedy the situation. And none of the approaches is perfect. So I don't know. I'd like to know what you had in mind in saying the ANC is hierarchically structured. Well, that's part of modern administration, and that the ANC was going to be just as authoritarian. That is not was not part of the plan. It's something that the ANC evolved into. So that's my reaction to your answer, your last answer.
Well, thank you. Yes, I think it's fascinating in the sense that I don't think Fanon is saying we got to have the perfect plan. In fact, he's not saying that at all. First of all, he doesn't believe there could be a thing like the perfect plan. And second, he's arguing in the examples that he gives, the bridge, for example, it's not a question of having the planners all agree what the perfect plan is and then putting that into practice. It's a question of having all the villagers agree whether they want to build the bridge and having them involved in the building of the bridge with, of course, the help of engineers and architects and so forth, but with them taking over, appropriating the bridge, in his words. I think it's a question of where of the idea of governance, of involving everyone in the governing. Now, of course, this would, and for Fanon, that necessarily starts, at the kind of commune level, at the village level, involving everyone in decision making. It may not seem very efficient, but then he says again that in the long run, having everyone knowing what's going on and agreeing and being part of the process of making the decision will actually make the whole program work out more efficiently in the end. He certainly doesn't believe in perfection. In a certain sense, his whole interest in psychoanalysis is an interest in the failures and imperfections of the human. In other words, we all are striving to do things better, but and we all come up with kind of react to our own failures and so forth, and try and so forth. And it's an ongoing process. It's an ongoing working out. But I think there's a fundamental division between Fanon's idea of what a decentralized and democratic decision-making, where everyone's involved in the decision-making, and the process of that decision-making will not be complete. It will be incomplete, will take time because of the demoralization of capitalism and colonialism that's been drummed into people's heads. Will be a slow process, and so forth. These are things that I think are maybe seem to be unrealistic in the kind of the high-powered politics of running a nation. But it's, from Fanon's point of view, it's a completely different notion of what running a nation is, because of his idea that decolonization has to be something so deep that all the daily practices of governance are challenged and thought through. How much does this practice of governance reconnect and make connections between human beings? In other words, that's the project. The project is rehumanizing humanity. So all the social relations of governance have to be, at the core, a question of rehumanizing humanity, bringing the human, connecting humans in a certain way, right? And we could say that, look, you can certainly, by talking about connecting humans, you could say, or reconnecting humans, disalienating humans, can certainly draw on customs, traditions, cultures that existed, before colonialism tried to destroy them. And they can all be enlivened and so forth. And we can learn from the ways in which these issues have been dealt with in other cultures and other times and so forth. But I think the important thing is, for Fanon, that that this question of the human is the central question, and it's not just the human as the object of of deliveries of deliveries, delivering food, delivering water, delivering. It's not just it's the human as involved in the process and decision making about life. And I think that's psychoanalytically, psychiatrically, and also politically, that's really his project.
Could I interject something here directly related to what you said and also to what Sally said? I think another way of looking at what we've been talking about in general, and my comments about the external threat versus what you need to do in the decolonialization process, is this liberatory project. These projects are incredibly complex. And I'll give you a specific example of what I'm talking about. Consider increasing democratic decision-making. But the minute that's said, there are already tensions the tension between democratic decision-making and the need for secrecy. And how do you balance them? The need for security in the decolonializing movement versus open access. How do you balance those tendencies? The need for surveillance in the emancipatory movement versus what's the opposite of surveillance? I can't think. But you have these tensions that go against what you consider yourself trying to build. And I often thought during the civil rights movement back in the 50s and 60s, that wouldn't it be wonderful to have a how-to manual for all of this? Not one that tells you specifically what to do in this specific situation, but at least something to say. Here are issues that you will most likely have to deal with, and putting them on the table so that you don't have to reinvent the wheel every time there's a crisis in your organization. And as I talked about it before with this group, one of the key concepts that we had to, as far as we knew, reinvent the wheel on was the idea of cephalism, the one head of the organization, the Martin Luther King, the Nelson Mandela. How do you deal with that? Because at the end of the day, that's a problem. It's an advantage and it's a problem, and that's the tension. So I just wanted to put that on the table. I don't necessarily expect a response, but I just wanted to.
I just want to say, I mean, I think they're really, Arthur, there's great points and really worth thinking about, really important. Just want to acknowledge that.
Yeah.
Okay. So we have a few questions. Michael Scott is asking a question, but he prefaces it with a comment. He says, "Thank you for a very exciting and inspiring presentation. Are you aware of any linkage between Angela Davis's work and activism and Frantz Fanon's legacy and thought? She would seem to be a progeny of Fanon, to his mind, but he has not been able to read her work and only have heard her speak publicly in recent addresses in recent years." So he wants to know the linkage between Angela Davis's work and Frantz Fanon's work.
I don't think there's any really close direct connection. I mean, Angela Davis does recognize Fanon. In fact, probably on one of those blurbs on the book or on the back of The Wretched of the Earth, there's probably a blurb from Angela Davis at some point. But I don't think there's any, I don't think Angela Davis was directly influenced or has written anything specific on Fanon more than passing references to.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Sangeeta also has a question. She begins by saying that this may be off theme. If so, it could be discussed in the after party. But she cannot shake off the idea that thinkers or scholars who die young live on across time, not at least in our digital times. So her question is, do they get a different uptake by media, groups and scholars as compared to those who live longer lives rather? In addition to Fanon, Vygotsky too is such a thinker, and she thinks he died at the age 37. This is not to mean that they did not write very relevant ideas, but She wonders whether Nigel or anyone at the forum has any thoughts between the young thinkers and those who die early and all that.
Fanon, of course, died before Algeria gained independence. He wanted to go back. I mean, his plan was to go back to Algiers and continue his work as a psychiatrist. And I think there's some, there's an insight in the question, in the sense that, Biko died young, Che died young. There's a certain sort of idea, Fanon died young. There's a certain idea of heroism in youthfulness, and therefore the idea of their revolutionary credential is never tarnished by, say, for example, being associated with the regime that came after the revolution. So I think there's a certain truth to that. That's my only comment on that.
Okay. Yeah. Christine also has a question. She starts by saying wonderful discussion. But can you talk about the role of language in Fanon's project, Rehumanizing Humanity?
That's a big question. I mean, it's interesting that don't forget the first chapter of Black Skin, White Masks is on language, the Black language. And of course, it's about French and the question of whether the Black man can actually speak French like the French. And of course they can, but then what does that, but then the meaning of that is really what's at stake, and the internalization of that meaning, and the idea that one speaks French like the French to get on in the world, to get on in the white world, becomes a question. And then he goes to he goes to Blida-Joinville hospital, and he wants to reform the hospital. It's a kind of pretty conservative psychiatric hospital, and he wants to sort of democratize it. He's been influenced by Tosquelles, a Spanish psychotherapist, Marxist, psychoanalyst, so he introduces all these programs into the wards that he has. He has two wards. He has a European women's ward and a Muslim male ward. And he starts all sorts of things like, he has a football, he creates a football pitch and football teams, and he has like a team that will go and play other teams and so forth. And he has, he creates a journal where he hopes that the patients will write for and edit and so forth. And he wants to democratize the decision making. He wants the patients to be involved in discussions about how the day goes. He wants the patients involved in thinking about their own care. He wants nurses to be involved in much more kind of open and discussions about what's going on in the hospital, sort of democratizing the institution. That's his plan. But then, and he brings all these ideas with him from France. But then this question of language is incredibly important because, you know, for a psychoanalyst, language is incredibly important, right? So the sessions with the patients, he's sitting there listening to patients, and he has translators, and they're translating from the Arabic, and the patient has this like 5-minute conversation or answer to what Fanon's asking. So Fanon's listening to the Arabic for about 5 minutes, and the translator says, oh, the patient just said like 2 lines. So Fanon knows there's something's up here. It's just not working because all the nuance of what's being said is being lost in translation. So Fanon's very critical of the program because of this, because of his lack of knowing Arabic, and in fact he tries to learn Arabic whilst he's at Bly de Joinville. So he's very concerned about language. And then the other side of that is Bly de Joinville is in the Kabylia region. So, which again is a question of language. But he learns through going into the mountains and visiting the villages and so forth. He does basic sort of anthropological work whilst he's at Bly de Joinville, and collecting information and understanding local customs and so forth. And he brings this stuff back into the hospital. In other words, so there had been he created these film nights, but the Arab patients, the Muslim patients, had no interest in the film nights. So then he kind of reforms this and brings in storytellers. And so there's a kind of storytelling, local storytellers come in, which he actually mentions he talks about the change in storytellers during the revolution in his chapter on national culture in The Wretched of the Earth. So he's very attuned to language, and the importance of language. I'm not too sure whether I answered the question, but I've now forgotten what the question was.
It was language, the role of language in the Fanon's project. Yeah, but I think you have. Yeah. So there's another question before I call Anissa. There's another question by Akpome. He says, great presentation and conversation, Nigel. He read the intro to the book that was shared in advance, and he thinks Atusechi Odu needs to update his contribution and what he mentioned about the 2020 End SARS campaign against police brutality and bad governance in Nigeria. Now, perhaps you can offer a comment. He's requesting that perhaps you can offer a comment on that as well. And he says that he has to attend something. So I think he wants a comment on the police brutality against the End SARS campaign and probably how it's related to Fanon.
I'm not really up to, he probably would know, he knows more than I do. I'm not up to speed on where the End SARS campaign is. And so I can't really offer a comment on it at the moment, but I'd love to hear about that. And as the as the editor of the Journal of Asian and African Studies, if he's writing an article about, if he wants to submit an article about the End SARS situation in Nigeria at this present time, I'd welcome the submission.
Okay. Okay. Before I hand over to Professor Makoni, Anissa, you've had your hand up for a while.
Thank you very much, Nelly. Thanks very much, Nigel, for this, for bringing so much color and clarity to this extremely important work from Fanon. Now, I isolated two little statements, and I'm trying to make sense. He emphasizes the involvement of everyone. And then I focus on rehumanizing humanity. And my question is, rehumanizing humanity according to whom?
According to those involved. In other words, making the connections, reconnecting. In other words, he talks about I mean, I think rather than having a sort of ideal type of what that is, he talked, for example, in the chapter on colonial wars and mental disorders, he talks about how life under colonialism meant it was a sort of it was like a farmyard where all the chickens would just like basically try to, the bread would be given out and all the chickens would fight over whatever the seeds were on, whatever seeds were left on the ground and so forth. And he says that, in this situation, every date grown was a victory. And so there's a sort of battle for survival under colonialism. And then he talks about how, the farmer would fight, or the peasant would fight his neighbor over the goat eating, grass on his patch. And it would be a battle for life. And he talks about how this completely changes during the liberation struggle. How how the peasant is no longer over, how the peasant's the most important thing for the peasant is no longer the life of the goat, but the idea of liberation, of this social liberation, of the connections, of making the connections with your neighbor, and struggling for a different kind of society where you wouldn't have to be determined by, the authorities who are now determining your life. So I think by that, so in a certain sense, for him, the revolution itself rehumanizes humanity. So it's a process. It's not like, oh, we're going to set up rehumanizing humanity seminars. It's rather that it's in the action of discussing, and we start and building the community, that we start rehumanizing humanity. I mean, that's the way he sort of explains it, at least.
Thanks very much.
Thank you all so much for the questions and for the comments. I'd like to hand over to Prof. Makoni for the final words.
Nigel,